Have you ever wondered how a single night of protest could ignite the flames of revolution? Picture the scene, a bustling colonial city shrouded in winter darkness. Harbor waters churning as over 100 determined colonists, faces obscured beneath Mohawk disguises, silently carry out an act that will echo through the centuries. The Boston Tea Party is more than a simple story of dumped tea. It's a turning point that forever changed the course of American and world history. To truly understand the Boston Tea Party, let's journey back to a time before America was a country, when the land we now call the United States was a patchwork of 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard of North America. These colonies, each with their own traditions and sense of self-governance, were, in the eyes of the British Crown, little more than distant territories subject to the laws and taxes set by a faraway parliament in London. The mid-1700s was a period of turbulence and transformation. The British Empire had just emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that pitted Britain and its allies against France and theirs. While the outcome expanded British influence, it came at a steep cost. The war left Britain with a staggering national debt. To pay for the defense of its vast new territories and the costs of war, Parliament turned to the colonies as a source of much-needed revenue. This led to a series of taxes and acts that would sow the seeds of discontent. The Sugar Act of 1764 placed duties on sugar and molasses imported into the colonies, aiming to both raise revenue and curb smuggling. The following year, the Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to purchase and use specially stamped paper for everything from legal documents to newspapers and playing cards. These taxes were not levied to fund improvements in the colonies, but rather to help pay Britain's bills. The colonists' response to these measures was swift and vocal. The rallying cry of "no taxation without representation" reverberated from town meetings to colonial assemblies. Colonists argued that it was unjust for Parliament to impose taxes on them when they had no elected representatives in the legislative body setting those taxes. Their resistance took many forms: boycotts of British goods, impassioned pamphlets, and public protests. In the face of colonial pressure, some taxes were rolled back, but Parliament was determined to assert its authority. In 1767, the Townshend Acts imposed new duties on imported goods, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and, most notably, tea. Once again, colonial outrage surged. Through persistent protest and non-importation agreements, most of the Townshend taxes were repealed by 1770. But one tax remained: the duty on tea. To British leaders, it was a simple matter of principle, a symbol of Parliament's right to make laws for the colonies. To the colonists, it was a symbol of tyranny and overreach. By the early 1770s, another crisis loomed. The British East India Company, a corporate giant and pillar of the empire, was facing financial ruin. Unsold tea piled up in warehouses, and the company was teetering on the brink of collapse. To rescue it, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. On the surface, this act seemed beneficial to the colonists. It actually lowered the price of tea by allowing the East India Company to sell directly to the colonies, bypassing middlemen and colonial merchants. But beneath this seemingly innocuous surface, the Tea Act carried deeper implications. It granted the East India Company an effective monopoly over the colonial tea trade. Colonial merchants were cut out of the lucrative business, and many saw this as a threat to their livelihoods. More importantly, accepting the tea and paying the tax would be a tacit acknowledgement of Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. Colonists saw through what they believed was a British ploy. They argued that cheaper tea was a Trojan horse, designed to seduce the colonists into surrendering their rights for the sake of a bargain. Instead of welcoming the tea, cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston refused to unload the ships sent by the East India Company. In Boston, however, the situation reached a boiling point. December 16, 1773. Boston's Old South Meeting House buzzed with tension. More than 5,000 colonists, merchants, tradesmen, artisans, and laborers packed the hall, debating what to do about the 3 tea ships sitting in Boston Harbor. The city's royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, had made it clear: The ships would not leave until their cargo was unloaded. The deadline to pay the duty and unload the tea was midnight. As night fell, a group of over 100 men, many affiliated with the Sons of Liberty, a secret society dedicated to resisting British rule, quietly slipped into the bitter cold. To conceal their identities and perhaps signal a symbolic connection with freedom, many disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. Their destination, Griffin's Wharf, where the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver waited with their holds full of tea. What followed was a display of discipline and unity. The men boarded the ships and, working efficiently and methodically, hauled 342 chests of tea from the holds and poured them into the black waters of Boston Harbor. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the splash of tea and the careful movements of the protesters. No other property was destroyed. No violence erupted. The entire operation took just a few hours, but the act was a thunderclap that would reverberate across an empire. When dawn broke over Boston, the harbor was stained by waves of floating tea leaves. The value of the destroyed tea was enormous. By today's standards, nearly $1.7 million, but the true cost would be measured not in pounds or pence, but in the shifting tides of history. News of the Boston Tea Party raced through the colonies and across the Atlantic. The British government responded with fury and resolve. King George III and his ministers, determined to reassert authority and punish the city, enacted a series of harsh retaliatory measures known as the Coercive Acts, called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed the city's vital harbor until the price of the destroyed tea was repaid, effectively strangling Boston's economy. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter, restricting town meetings and placing greater power in the hands of the royal governor. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain, not in the colonies. These acts were intended to isolate Boston and make an example of its rebellious citizens, but they had the opposite effect. Across the colonies, sympathy for Boston ran high. Food and supplies poured in from neighboring towns and distant colonies. Leaders who had once disagreed now found common cause. Out of this sense of unity, the First Continental Congress convened in 1774, bringing together representatives from 12 colonies to coordinate a response to British policy. The Boston Tea Party proved to be more than an act of protest. It was a declaration, a statement that the colonists would not be cowed, bribed, or tricked into surrendering their rights. No longer was the conflict simply about taxes. It was about the fundamental principles of liberty, representation, and self-governance. Within 2 years, the first shots of the Revolutionary War rang out at Lexington and Concord. What began as a protest over tea had transformed into a movement for independence. Within a decade, the United States of America emerged as a new nation, founded on ideals that would inspire future generations. The legacy of the Boston Tea Party extends far beyond the destruction of tea. It galvanized colonial resistance and inspired a wave of civil disobedience throughout the colonies. Merchants and consumers alike boycotted British goods, fueling a sense of shared purpose and identity. The courage of the Sons of Liberty became legend, and the city of Boston gained an enduring reputation as a cradle of revolution. The act of dumping tea into the harbor was a masterstroke of protest. It was nonviolent but dramatic, illegal but moral in the eyes of many. It sent a clear message. Ordinary citizens, when united, could stand up to the most powerful empire the world had ever known. This principle of civil disobedience would echo through the centuries. The Boston Tea Party inspired abolitionists fighting against slavery, suffragists demanding the right to vote, and civil rights activists challenging segregation and injustice. Even today, the symbolism of Tea Party protests continues to resonate in political movements that speak out against perceived tyranny. The Boston Tea Party also left its mark on how Americans view symbols of authority and power. Tea, once a beloved drink, became a symbol of oppression and resistance. The Sons of Liberty, men like Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and John Hancock, became heroes, their names woven into the fabric of American identity. Today, the Boston Tea Party ships and museum stands on the waterfront as a living memorial to that night. Visitors can walk the decks of replica ships, relive the events, and reflect on the courage and conviction it took to challenge the status quo. But what, ultimately, was the Boston Tea Party about? At its core, it was about more than just tea. It was about freedom, identity, and the power of ordinary people to make history. It was about the refusal to be ruled without consent, the insistence on rights that no distant government could take away. The Boston Tea Party reminds us that history is shaped not just by kings and parliaments, but by citizens willing to stand up for what they believe. It shows that even a single night of protest, carried out with resolve and purpose, can set in motion events that change the world. As we look back on the Boston Tea Party, we see the birth of a spirit that would come to define America. A spirit of resistance, a belief in liberty, and a willingness to challenge injustice, no matter the odds. So, was the Boston Tea Party an act of patriotism or rebellion? In truth, it was both. It was an act of defiance against what the colonists saw as illegitimate authority, and it was a bold step toward independence and self-determination. The ripples of that night in Boston Harbor spread far and wide. They united the colonies, sparked a revolution, and inspired the creation of a nation founded on the principles of liberty and justice. The story of the Boston Tea Party is not just a chapter in American history, it's a testament to the power of ordinary people to shape their own destiny. As we reflect on the events of December 16, 1773, let us remember the lessons of the Boston Tea Party. That the fight for justice and representation is a journey that requires courage, unity, and unyielding resolve. Let us honor those who dared to make a stand, knowing that, in doing so, they changed the course of history for generations to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most pivotal nights in American history. Whether you see the Boston Tea Party as an act of patriotism, rebellion, or both, its legacy endures, reminding us that the pursuit of liberty is a story that continues to unfold. What do you think? Was the Boston Tea Party an act of justified protest or an act of lawless defiance? However you view it, one thing is certain. On that cold December night, when barrels of tea tumbled into Boston Harbor, a revolution began, not just against attacks, but for the right of a people to decide their own fate. Until next time, thank you for joining us to explore the night that changed American history forever.